Hello everyone, and welcome back to Wrestling with Rahxephon. Now, as is the case in most of these retrospectives, this is the part where we're going to start looking at characters, and we're not going to look at every character. We'll start by looking at some of the most important ones of the series, and then I'll decide whether or not a character deserves their own video or special mention elsewhere. We're going to start off with the commander himself, Mr. Jin Kunugi. Now, I want to start off with Commander Kunugi because I feel that he is the safest character to start with. Now, as mentioned earlier in the previous videos, one of the weakest aspects of Rahxephon, something it struggles with the most, is consistent characterization and character writing. Often characters kind of have to choose between being either relevant to the lore or plot, or being well developed. There are a few characters that don't really do either, and there are a few that do both, but a lot of them struggle with being both relevant and well developed. For this reason though, Kunugi feels like a safe pick to me though, as he both has sufficient characterization and a nice arc, and he's quite relevant to the plot and lore of the series. Before we see how though, let's get a brief look at this guy's story. Now, Commander Kunugi is introduced in episode 4 as the commander of the Terra base on Naraikanai. He is initially extremely cold and dismissive of Ayato, which we learn is due to Ayato's new blood, and he also seems to be completely apathetic to almost everything and everyone around him, even if he does take his job rather seriously. This job consists of Kunugi overseeing missions from Terra HQ and just doing general strategizing. Outside of missions, he also seems to be quite buried in paperwork and spends some time with his pet bird. As the series progresses though, we start to get to know Kunugi more, especially in episode 10, which is essentially the Kunugi episode, and here we learn that Kunugi has always been a rather distant man and as such has always buried himself in his work. In the past though, this work happened to be for a Mu defector in the Japanese Ground Self-Defense Forces, and as such Kunugi was essentially forced to turn Tokyo into the Tokyo Jupiter, and in the process killing many, including his own daughter. This explains his numb and cold demeanor, as it stems not only from a sense of loss, but also from a sense of self-resentment for carrying the order out in the first place, and never really spending enough time with his family anyways. As the series progresses though, we soon see that the commander was never fully consumed by this self-resentment, as he does remain level-headed and fair throughout the series, and even warming up a bit, going as far to essentially allow Ayato to escape to Tokyo Jupiter when he refuses to order any kind of capture of him. This is undone, however, by Makoto taking over at that moment and essentially ordering LV to go after Ayato. This act of willful negligence, however, sees Kunugi dismissed by Makoto and essentially forced on administrative leave. He is reinstated though upon Makoto's downfall, and having had time to reflect on his own issues, especially on how being so walled off is not necessarily a good thing, Kunugi seems to turn over a new leaf, as he even invites Ayato over for dinner and smiles at him. This is short-lived, however, as Kunugi then willingly sacrifices himself in order to take down a Mu ship led by his old defector boss, avenging his daughter and sacrificing himself for the greater good all at once. Now, being fully transparent, I think Kunugi is probably one of the strongest members of the supporting cast in terms of writing, and he's definitely my favorite. As someone who also hates his job and spends his spare time staring at random walls, I find this guy to be probably the most relatable member of the cast, and I think his arc is a subtle but very well done one. While many characters in the series struggle to be both plot and lore relevant, Kunugi manages to do both of these, all the while having a nice little arc about repenting for past mistakes while befriending Ayato. I also want to quickly bring up Kunugi's relationship with Major Yagamo. At first these two seem completely opposed, as Yagamo is almost always completely friendly and sunny. Even if he is still a very competent commander, his demeanor is almost completely opposite of his commanding officer, as Kunugi is, as established, quite cold and distant. However, I think this is very fitting, as Yagamo is also a noticeably younger man than Kunugi. He's a man who still has ambitions and feelings in life, and I think Kunugi really gets along with Yagamo well, because at least to me it seems like Kunugi wants to protect Yagamo. In some ways he even views him as a sort of son, and Kunugi doesn't want Yagamo to repeat the mistakes that he's made. When Kunugi sacrifices himself to save everyone, I think Yagamo is one of the driving motivations for him to do this, as in Yagamo, Kunugi sees a version of himself pre-mistake, a version of himself which can still be fixed and can still live a completely moral life. Kunugi is thus driven to protect his protege in order to, if not completely absolve himself, then prevent someone else from kind of suffering the same fate he has. Their dynamic is one that, while subtle, is nicely fleshed out and does add to both characters, as Yagamo can see Kunugi as a sort of wise, hardened leader, and Kunugi can see Yagamo as a sort of inspiration to prove that his work is impactful and that his work does still make meaningful contributions to society. Establishing Kunugi's character, of all the bridge staff, he is almost certainly the oldest and definitely the most scarred. This has led to him becoming emotionally numb and coldly logical. He doesn't approach his work with a naive hope or even a burning rage, but instead a very steady and restrained pace forward. His approach is always calculated and measured, and he never loses his temper. He does have moments of annoyance or snarkiness, but he is always in some form of emotional control, and even if we do start to see him express certain emotions as the series progresses, and even as we are allowed in episode 10 to actually see a very vulnerable moment for Kunugi as he weeps over his daughter's cemetery plot. Kunugi has been hardened by loss, and has such grown numb to his own emotions. He does have them though, but his past traumas and distant nature leads him to repress them, giving rise to his cold exterior and the impression that he doesn't necessarily value human life. This chilly first impression, and Kunugi's distrust of anything new, is what sets the stage for his initial troubled relationship with Ayato, and our initial introduction to this man is a very cold and calculating one. Since Kunugi refuses to fully trust Ayato, and possibly be hurt, and Ayato is simply unaware of Kunugi's past, we are setting the stage for a relationship at loggerheads. As the two work together more though, and learn more about each other, they slowly start to accept the idea of getting along. And eventually they even do. And this is done in a very slow and gradual manner, which is something I appreciate. There is no scene where Kunugi and Ayato are kind of forced into a desperate situation, and now they're buddy-buddy because they had a one big episode together. There's no scene like that. Instead, it's a very realistic and slow, gradual growth to a level of mutual respect and trust, combined with Kunugi's reflection on his own flaws, eventually helping him to overcome his walled-off nature. It's important that he does this, as it proves that Kunugi has reflected on his own traumas and accepted that perhaps walling himself off to everybody is counterproductive, and that he does need to sort of work out his issues in some healthy manner, as him failing to do so might lead some to see him as a sociopath. He is not, however. That's not true, and in fact, when he says early on that a single life isn't important, I think that's more of him trying to justify his past sins in an attempt to cope with him. This denial stems from a sense of self-loathing for his past transgressions and failures. While he questioned the orders to turn Tokyo into Tokyo Jupiter, he never actually defied them, and he still carried them out. He never took a stand at that critical juncture, and thus has never lived it down, and it bothers him almost as much as the actual events that he carried out. He loathed himself for being weak and not taking a stand when he possibly could have. With more time, though, this denial starts to go away as he starts to work through things, and as we start to see his more human layers come out. He stops trying to justify his past actions, and at some point he simply accepts them and their consequences as things that have happened and cannot be undone. We see this when he accepts the split between him and his wife, when she says that she's moving to France and is probably never going to see him again, and he just goes, well, yeah, I understand. And when he goes to his daughter's funeral plot and, weeping over it, accepts that he is the one who indirectly killed her. He accepts things, and even if he knows he can't undo them, he's starting to form some kind of resolve to somehow pay up for these events. With some more time, he starts to ponder on the possibility on how to do this, and by the end of the series, he sacrifices himself to save others, not only for the sake of avenging his daughter, but also to prove that he does value human life and is willing to give his own to save that of many others. And all of this is what makes Kunugi's arc so memorable to me, is how slow and measured it is. There's never a scene where he has an emotional breakdown, and he never fixates on justifying his mistakes, or even of achieving some sort of forgiveness. There is no rant, there is just slow, resigned speech and objective facts. He doesn't think that he can be forgiven completely, and he knows that the past cannot be undone. He's given up on the idea of making everything whole again, including himself, and is now simply satisfied with the idea of trying to pay up in a sense. He knows that his hands are not clean, and thus he offers himself up to whatever retribution may come, so long as that it doesn't affect those who are not him. While this is evident of some lingering self-loathing, the fact that he no longer simply lives in an apathetic limbo and even grows to befriend Ayato do signify a great deal of realistic character growth. And I want to specify realistic, as I never got the feeling that Kunugi completely got over things, or became super empathetic and warm, or became a whole new man, or even became whole again thanks to the power of anime friendship. Nothing like that occurred. Instead, Kunugi is just some guy who has made mistakes and has resolved to pay for them in his own terms any way he can. He is a man who never forgot the past and never quite forgave himself. He never got full closure. But he knows that he still has to push through anyways, and has learned to live with himself to a functional extent in order to try and make up for his past transgressions as much as he possibly can. He knows who he is, and he knows he will never be whole again. But he still knows that even in this state, he can make meaningful contributions to society. And I really think this is realistic because in our own world, there are many things that all of us will have to deal with. And there are many experiences which will shape us in many different ways. And even if we overcome every single challenge we have, not all loose ends will be 100% resolved at all times. There will be things that bother us, and there will be things that we'll have to move on from. As in many real-world scenarios, there is no magic solution in Kunugi's case. No way for him to fully go back to the person that he was before. No way to undo his past mistakes, and no way to completely wash away all of the regret he feels for the mistakes he's made. But he knows that and adapts, and he learns that wallowing around in self-pity and self-loathing isn't going to fix anything, and that while he can't undo anything, he can try to make amends or pay up in his own way. However, doing that requires taking action, and you can't take action if you're just wallowing around in self-pity or apathy at all times. That sometimes you do have to just try your best to trudge through things. And while his apathy may make some think that he is amoral, I think the fact that Commander Kunugi willingly sacrifices himself proves that he is moral, and that he's just grappling with the opposing knowledge of what's right and what he's done, ultimately coming to the conclusion that just because he's committed wrongs in the past, he can still try to do what's right today.